The American Revolution and Confederation, 1774 to 1787. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing as Chapter 4, as I'm going to read through it. I'm going to sum up the main points of what we have here in terms of our just key definitions. Keep those definitions in mind as you go through and read those key concepts on your own. I'm going to try to go through this quickly just so we're not spending an hour and a half talking about the American Revolution. Let me zoom in. Parliament's passage of the Intolerable Acts in 1774 intensified the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. In the next 2 years, many Americans reached a conclusion, unthinkable only a few years earlier, that the only solution to their quarrel with the British government was to sever all ties with it. How did the events from 1774 to 1776 lead ultimately to this revolutionary outcome? You want to make sure you understand this definition in the First Continental Congress. This is talking about how it would lead to the American Revolution. The Punitive Intolerable Acts drove all these colonies except Georgia to send delegates to a convention in Philadelphia in 1774. The purpose of the convention was later known as the FCC, the First Continental Congress. It was to respond to what the delegates viewed as Britain's alarming threats to their liberties. However, most Americans had no desire for independence. They simply wanted to protest parliamentary infringements of their rights and restore the relationship between the crown that had existed before the 7 Years' War. So the First Continental Congress, you're looking at this as a meeting to convention with all of the colonies with the exception of Georgia. And what they're saying is we just want to go back to our old ways when Britain left us alone. We don't want to go to war. All right. The delegates. The delegates were a diverse group whose views about the crisis ranged from radical conservative. Leading the radical faction, those demanding the greatest concessions for Britain, were Patrick Henry of Virginia and Samuel Adams of John Adams of Massachusetts. The moderates included George Washington of Virginia and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. The conservative delegates, who favored a mild statement of protest, included John Jay and Joseph Galloway. Unrepresented were the loyal colonists, who would not challenge the king's government anyway. So you're getting diversity here. So what they mean is you're getting people that are very radical. Henry and the Adams cousins, they are looking more likely to probably go towards revolution. On the other hand, you're getting people that are more moderate. They just want some protest. And then you're getting some people that want very minimal protest. But who's not there, of course, are the Loyalists, people that loved Mother Britain. Actions of Congress. The delegates voted on a series of proposed measures, each of which intended to change policy without offering moderate and conservative colonists. Offending moderate and conservative colonists. Joseph Galloway proposed a plan similar to the Albany Plan that would have reordered relations with Parliament and formed a union of the colonies within the British Empire. By only one vote, Galloway's plan failed to pass. Instead, the convention adopted these measures. It endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, a statement originally issued by Massachusetts. The resolves called for the immediate repeal of the Intolerable Acts and for colonies to resist them, making military preparations and boycotting British goods. So they're basically saying is we got to get rid of those intolerable acts and we're going to continue to boycott. It passed the Declaration of Resolves. Sorry, I had to take that phone call. I believe we left off where fighting begins. Angrily dismissing a petition of the First Continental Congress, the King's government declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion and sent additional troops to put down further disorders there. Combination of colonial defiance and British determination to suppress it led to violent clashes in Massachusetts. What would prove to be the first battles of the American Revolution? So the First Continental Congress, of course, they go ahead and they defy a lot of those orders set by the monarchy. And the first battles we're going to get. Lexington Concord. On April 8th, 1775, General Thomas Gage, the commander of the British troops in Boston, sent a large force to seize colonial military supplies in the town of Concord. Warned of the British mark by two riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, the militia, or Minutemen of Lexington, assembled on the village green to face the British. The Americans were forced to retreat under heavy British fire. Eight of their number were killed in a brief encounter. Who fired the first shot of the first skirmish of the American Revolution? The evidence is ambiguous, and the answer will probably never be known. So Lexington Concord, first shots of the American Revolution. What you end up getting here is the British are trying to seize weapons, military supplies. Continuing their march, the British entered Concord, where they destroyed some military supplies. On the return march to Boston, the long column of British soldiers were attacked by hundreds of militiamen firing at them from behind stone walls. The British suffered 250 casualties and also considerable humiliation at being so badly mauled by the amateur fighters. So think about this: as the British are trying to seize these military weapons, they're ambushed by 250 militia men or minutemen that are not trained. And this is a huge blow to Great Britain because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that they're losing to these people that aren't necessarily trained. Next, we get the Battle of Bunker Hill. 2 months later, on June 17 and 75, a true battle was fought between opposing armies on the outskirts of Boston. A colonial militia of Massachusetts farmers fortified Breed's Hill next to Bunker Hill, for which was the ensuing battle was wrongly named, so it should have been actually called Breed's Hill. A British force attacked the colonists' position and managed to take the hill, suffered over 1,000 casualties. Americans claimed a victory of sorts, having succeeded in inflicting heavy losses on the attacking British army. So although the colonists lost, they're saying, hey, the good thing is we're able to kill a good amount of those British soldiers. So those were the first two battles. As a result of this, we get the Second Continental Congress. Soon after the fighting broke out in Massachusetts, delegates to the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in May 1775. The Congress is divided. One group of delegates, mainly from New England, thought the colonies should declare their independence. Another group, mainly from the middle colonies, hoped that the conflict should be negotiating a new relationship with Britain. So one thing you want to understand is a divide. New England is saying independence. On the other hand, you are getting the middle and southern colonies that not so much. Just let's make things better. Military actions. The Congress upon adopted a declaration of the causes and necessities for taking up arms, and called on the colonies to provide troops. George Washington was appointed the commander-in-chief of a new colonial army sent to Boston to lead the Massachusetts militia and volunteer units from other colonies. Congress also authorized a force under Benedict Arnold to raid Quebec in order to draw Canada away from the British Empire. An American Navy and Marine Corps was organized in the fall of 1775 for the purpose of attacking British shipping. So in the Second Continental Congress, you're getting the formation of kind of this organized army. Peace efforts. At first, the Congress adopted a contradictory policy of waging war while at the same time seeking a peaceful settlement. Very important. They want to prevent war, but at the same time, they're also ready to go to war. Many in the colonies did not want independence, or they valued their heritage and Britain's protection, but they did not want to change their relationship with Britain. In 75, the delegates voted to send an olive branch petition, very important definition, to King George III, in which they pledged their loyalty and asked the king to intercede with Parliament to secure peace and protection of the colonies. King George angrily dismissed the Congress's plea and agreed to Parliament's Prohibitory Act, which declared the colonies in rebellion. A few months later, the Parliament forbade all trade and shipping between colonies and Great Britain. So you understand the Second Continental Congress is very important because it established an army, but it also established the Olive Branch Petition, which was a letter sent to King George III saying, hey, we want peace. We still swear loyalty to you. We just want things to go back the way they were before we went to war. Or not war, sorry, before the French and Indian War, before the Proclamation of 1763. King George says, heck no. In fact, he says that you are now in rebellion, and we're going to stop trade. So this is going to go ahead and lead to further tensions. Thomas Paine's argument for independence. In January 1776, a pamphlet was published that quickly had a profound impact on public opinion and the future course of events. The pamphlet, written by Thomas Paine, a recent English immigrant to the colonies, argued strongly for what until then had been considered a radical idea. It was entitled Common Sense. Paine's essay argued in clear and forceful language for the colonies becoming independent states and breaking all political ties with the British monarchy. Paine argued that it was contrary to common sense for a large continent to be ruled by a small and distant island, for people to pledge allegiance to a king whose government was corrupt and whose laws were unreasonable. So remember, there were a lot of colonies that did not necessarily want independence, but Thomas Paine's common sense in arguing that why is there such a small little island that's ruling over such a large land where they are so distant and far away? We need to declare our independence. So this would be the push that would go ahead and push a lot of people to want independence from Great Britain. The Declaration of Independence. After meeting for more than a year, the Congress gradually and somewhat reluctantly began to favor independence rather than reconciliation. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring the colonies to be independent. 5 delegates, including Jefferson, formed a committee to write a statement in support of Lee's resolution. The declaration, drafted by Jefferson, listed specific grievances against George III's government and also expressed the basic principles that justified the revolution. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Congress adopted Lee's resolution calling for independence on July 2nd. Jefferson's working Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. Declaration of Independence, think about that breakup letter that I read to you guys where you all fell for it, right? It's declaring the terrible things that were going on and how life was so good, but then all of a sudden, you change, I've changed, and now we're breaking up. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is, the breakup letter to Great Britain. The Revolutionary War. From the first shots fired on Lexington Green in 1775 to the final signing of a peace treaty in 83, the American War of Independence, or Revolutionary War, was a long and bitter struggle. As Americans fought, they also forged a new national identity as the former colonies became the United States of America. About 2.6 million people lived in the 13 colonies at the time of war. Maybe 40% of the people actively participated in the struggle against Britain. They called themselves patriots. Around 20 to 30% sided with the British. They were loyalists. Everyone else tried to remain neutral and uninvolved. So keep those numbers in mind. America's very divided. Let's talk about who these patriots are. Think about that SNL film I showed you guys. The Patriots, the largest number of patriots were from New England, the States, and Virginia. Tom Brady. Woo! Most of the soldiers were reluctant to travel outside their own region. They would serve in local militia units for short periods, leave to work their farms, and then return to their duty. Thus, even though several 100,000 people fought on the Patriot side of the war, General Washington never had more than 20,000 regular troops under his command at one time. His army was chronically short of supplies, poorly equipped, and rarely paid. Big one, rarely paid. African Americans. Initially, George Washington rejected the idea of African Americans serving in the Patriot Army. However, when the British promised freedom to enslaved people who joined their side, Washington and the Congress quickly made the same offer. Approximately 5,000 African Americans fought as patriots. Most of them were free citizens from the North who fought in racially mixed forces. Although there were some all African American units, African Americans took part in most of the military actions of the war, and a number, including Peter Salem, were recognized for their bravery. So they did participate in interracial squads, right? There weren't necessarily segregated squads during this time. Loyalists. Loyalists, also known as Tories, the Revolutionary War was in some respects a civil war in which anti-British patriots fought pro-British royalists. Those who maintained their allegiance to the king were called Tories, although the majority party, after the majority party in Parliament. Almost 60,000 American Tories fought next to British soldiers, supplied them with arms and food, and joined in raiding parties that pillaged patriot homes and farms. Members of the same family sometimes joined opposite sides. For example, while Benjamin Franklin was a leading patriot, his son, William, joined the Tories and served as the last royal governor of New Jersey. How many American Tories were there? Well, there was about 520,000 to 780,000 people, roughly 20 to 30% of the population. In New York, New Jersey, and Georgia, they were probably the majority. Towards the end of the war, about 80,000 loyalists emigrated from the States to settle in Canada or Britain, rather than face persecution at the hands of victorious patriots. So a good third of the population. And you want to think about this as they were typically the wealthier people, the people that were closer to the East Coast. They had, they had ties to Britain. Although loyalists came from all groups and classes, they tend to be wealthier, as I stated, and more conservative. Most government officials and Anglican clergy in America remain loyal to the crown. Last but not least, American Indians. At first, American Indians tried to stay out of the war. Eventually, however, attacks by colonists prompted many American Indians to support the British, who promised to limit colonial settlement in the West. Remember that it was the British that supported the proclamation in 1763. If you don't know what that is, and you are okay, because I'll tell you what it is. It prevented the colonists moving westward. Initial American losses and hardships. The first 3 years of the war, 75 to 77, went badly for Washington. poorly trained and equipped Revolutionary Army. It barely escaped complete disaster in the battle for New York City in 76, in which Washington forces were routed by the British. By 77, the British occupied both New York and Philly. After Philly, Washington's demoralized troops suffered through the severe winter of 77 to 78, camped at Valley Forge. So, all in all, it sucked for the colonists in early stages. Economic troubles added to the Patriots' bleak prospects. British occupation of American ports resulted in a 95% decline in between 75 and 77. Goods were scarce and inflation was rampant. The paper money issued by Congress, known as Continental, because worthless. So they were also economically dying because remember, they depended on Great Britain. So, alliance with France. This is going to be a huge change. The turning point for the American revolutionaries came with the victory at Saratoga in upstate 77. British forces under General John Burgoyne had marched from Canada in an ambitious effort to link up with other forces from the West and South. The objective was to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. But Burgoyne's troops were attacked by Saratoga by troops commanded by American generals. Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. The British Army was forced to surrender. The diplomatic outcome, the Battle of Saratoga, was even more important than the military result. News of the surprising American victory persuaded France to join in the war against Britain. France's king, King Louis, and terrible Roman numerals and speaking English, as you can see, was an absolute monarch who had no interest in aiding a revolutionary movement. Nevertheless, he saw a chance to weaken the country's traditional foe, Great Britain, by helping to undermine its colonial empire. I believe that was 15th. I could be wrong. King Louis XV. France had secretly extended aid to American Revolution as early as 75, giving both money and supplies. After Saratoga in 78, France was openly allied itself with the Americans. A year later, Spain and Holland also entered the war against the Brits. A French alliance proved a decisive factor in the American struggle for independence as it widened the war and forced the British to divert military resources away from America. So Battle of Saratoga was very important because King Louis the 15th goes ahead and provides aid, more important, naval aid, the Navy to America, which is able to push back the British. Spain and Holland contribute as well, right? But this is a huge reason why we are victorious. Faced with the larger war, Britain decided to consolidate its forces in America. British troops were pulled out of Philly and New York and became the chief base of British operations. In the campaign 78-79, the Patriots led by George Rogers Clark adopted a series of in campaign 78-79, the British led by George Rogers Clark captured a series of British forts in Illinois country to gain control with parts of the vast Ohio country. In 1780, the British Army adopted a southern strategy, concentrating its military campaigns in Virginia and the Carolinas, where Loyalists were especially numerous and active. Yorktown was an important battle in 1781. It was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, fought near Yorktown, Virginia, on the shores of Chesapeake Bay. Strongly supported by the French naval and military forces, Washington's army forced the surrender of a large British naval commanded by General Charles Cornwallis. The Treaty of Paris, news of Cornwallis' defeat at Yorktown, was a heavy blow to the Tory party and Parliament was conducting the war. The war had become unpopular in Britain, partly because it placed a heavy strain on the economy and government's finances. Because remember, they're also dependent on the raw resources coming from colonies. Lord North and other Tory ministers resigned and were replaced by Whig leaders to end the war. In Paris, 1783, the Treaty of Peace was finally signed by various belligerents. The Treaty of Paris, provided for the following. Britain would recognize the existence of the colonies as an independent nation. The Mississippi River was the western boundary of the nation. Americans would have the rights off of the coast of Canada, and Americans would pay debts owed to British merchants and honor Loyalist claims confiscated for the war. All in all, what you understand is these battles right here, Yorktown, is significant because it's leading to the downfall of Great Britain. Treaty of Paris is signed, and with that Treaty of Paris, America is given our independence. However, the borders were set up, and at the same time, we need to pay Britain for that war because of those damages. Organization of new governments. While the Revolutionary War was being fought, leaders of the 13 colonies worked to change them in an independently governed state, each with its own constitution, written plan of government. At the time, the Revolutionary Congress that originally met in Philadelphia tried to define the powers of a new central government for the nation that was coming into being. State governments. By 1777, 10 of the former colonies had written new constitutions. Most of these documents were both written and adopted by the state's legislatures. In a few of the states, Maryland and Pennsylvania and North Carolina, a proposed constitution was submitted to a vote for the people for ratification. Each state constitution was a subject of a heated debate between conservatives who stressed the need for law and order and liberals who were most concerned about protecting individual rights and preventing future tyrannies. Although the various constitutions differed on specific points, they had the following features in common. So what we end up getting is we're starting to get these state colonies that are formulating. All right, and there's a lot of debate going on between should they be strict or should they be more liberal and more free because they don't want anything to represent the monarchy in England. List of rights. Each state began with a bill or declaration of rights and freedoms, such as jury trial and freedom of religion, that belong to citizen and state officials that cannot infringe. Think about our Bill of Rights today. Separation of powers. With few exceptions, the powers of the state government were given to three branches. The legislative, the power to elect the two-house legislator. The executive powers, an elected governor. And judicial powers, the system courts. The principle of separation of powers was intended to safeguard against tyranny. So the separation of powers, take three branches, were created specifically because they did not want one person to have too much power or one branch to have too much power. The voting. The right to vote was extended to all white males who owned some property. The property requirement, usually for a minimal amount of land or money, was based on the assumption that property owners had a larger stake in government than any of the poor. So it's saying most people agreed that, hey, people should be allowed to vote, but it should be white people that had property because they're well educated and they have more stake in terms of the way the country should be governed or the state should be governed. Office holding, those seeking elected office were held to a higher property qualification than the voters, right? So they should own more land. So with that in mind, we have what we call the Articles of Confederation that would come to existence. This is the first government that is set up. At Philadelphia in 76, as Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson drafted the first Constitution of the United States as a nation. Congress modified Dickinson's plan to protect the powers of the individual states. The Articles of Confederation, as the document was called, was adopted by Congress in 1777, and it's submitted to the states for ratification. Ratification means it needs to be passed. Ratification of the Articles was delayed by a dispute over the vast American Indian lands over the Alleghenies. Seaboard states such as Rhode Island and Maryland insisted that these lands be under the jurisdiction of the new central government. When Virginia and New York finally agreed to cede their claims to Western lands, Articles were ratified in 1781. So there was just debate over land, and once New York and Virginia, the two largest states, agreed to just cede this over to the West and it could be further explored, then hey, we'll go ahead and pass this. To structure the government, the Articles established a central government that consisted of just one body, a Congress. That was it. It was a one-house legislature, which each state was given one vote, with at least 9 votes out of 13 required to pass important laws. Among the Articles required a unanimous vote. Committee states, which one representative from each state can make minor decisions when the full Congress is not in session. So you're already seeing the problems here. There's no executive. There's no president. All it is Congress. And you're given one vote. Doesn't matter how large your population is. And you need 9 out of 13 votes in order to pass something. That is a lot. And in order to change government, you need unanimous, meaning everybody needs to vote and agree on it. Right? Powers. The Articles gave the Congress the power to wage war, make treaties, send diplomatic representatives, and borrow money. However, Congress did not have the power to regulate commerce or to collect taxes. To finance any of its decisions, the Congress had to rely upon taxes voted by each state. Neither did the government have the executive power to enforce its laws. So there was no executive branch, meaning there was no way to execute these laws. So I could go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and do this, and go back home and be like, hell no, I ain't doing that. Accomplishments. Despite its weaknesses under the Articles, there was some things that we could be proud of. Winning the war. The U.S. government could claim some credit for the victory of Washington's army for negotiating favorable things with the Treaty of Peace. Land Ordinance of 1785. So Congress established a policy for surveying and selling the Western lands, right? The policy provider setting aside one section of land, and each township was set for public education. So it's going ahead, all in all, it's basically saying that it sets a precedent for how America is going to move westward. Northwest Ordinance of 1787 for a larger territory line between Great Lakes and Ohio River. The Congress passed an ordinance that set the rules for creating new states. So as people move westward, it goes ahead and sets how we will add states to the nation, right? So land ordinance, way of surveying land. Northwest Ordinance, how to become a state. However, there are many problems. First one is financial. Most war debts were unpaid. Individual states as well as Congress issued worthless paper money. The underlying problem was that Congress had no taxing power. So there's no way to pay these debts because there's no way that you could tax, right? And you could ask different states for money, but no one wanted to contribute. A lot of people were broke. Foreign European nations had little respect for a new nation that could neither pay its debts, who we owed to the French, to the British, to Spain. Britain and Spain threatened to take advantage of the U.S. weakness by expanding their interest in Western land as soon as the war ended. So they're going to go ahead and perhaps attack, which they do. Domestic. In the summer of 76, Captain Daniel Shays, a Massachusetts farmer and veteran, led other farmers in uprising for high states taxes, imprisonment for debt, and lack of paper money. The rebel farmers stopped the collection of taxes, forced the closing of debtors in January 1787 when Shays and his followers attempted to seize weapons from the Springfield Armory. The state militia Massachusetts broke Shays' rebellion. So Shays' rebellion, remember, they were unhappy because the government kept foreclosing, taking over farms. And at the same time, these veterans weren't being paid money they were promised. So they go ahead and rebel, and the state of Massachusetts, they have to organize a militia, and they're asking the federal government for help to put down this militia. And it's very tough to do, right? Shows a weakness of the federal government, that they can't do this. Social change. I mean, ideally, what they would have wanted was there's a government army, we'll put down a rebellion. But no one wanted to formulate a government army. No one was willing to volunteer their soldiers. In addition to revolutionizing the politics of the 13 statements, war, so really quick, backtrack, no Shays Rebellion, very important. Social change. In addition to revolutionizing the politics of 13 states, the war for independence also profoundly changed American society. Some changes occurred immediately before the war ended, while others evolved gradually as the ideas of the revolution began to filter into the attitudes of the common people. Abolition of the aristocratic ties. So these are some social changes. State constitutions abolish old institutions that originated in medieval Europe. No legislator could grant titles of nobility, or could any court recognize a practice of primogeniture, which means the son's right to inherit this property. So there's no inheritance, there's no aristocracy, there's no nobility. Whatever aristocracy exists in colonial America, that was gone by this point, right? So there's no way I could say, hey, I have to give this to my firstborn son, right? And my secondborn is going to get nothing. No. Most states adopted the principle of separation of church and state. In other words, they refused to give financial support to any religious group. The Anglican Church, which formerly had been closely tied with the king, was disestablished in the South. Only in 3 New England states, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, did the Congregational Church continue to receive state support in the form of religious tax. This practice was discontinued by the early 1830s. So, Congregational Church still exists until 1830s. I mean, that doesn't say that you would be part of it. It just means that you will go ahead and obtain, the church was getting money from the taxes. Like, it doesn't mean you get to be part of it, though. Women, very important to understand, because I think there might be a question that shows the progression of women's rights throughout history. During the war, both the Patriots and Loyalists depended on the active support of women. Some women followed their men into armed camps and worked as cooks and nurses. In a few instances, women actually fought in the battle, either taking their husband's place, as Mary McCauley or Molly Pitcher did at the Battle of Monmouth, or passing as a man serving as a soldier, as Deborah Sampson did for a year. The most important contribution for women during the war was mainly in the colonial economy. While fathers, husbands, and sons were away fighting, women ran the family farm and businesses. They provided such much of that for food and clothing, despite the necessary for the war effort. Despite their contributions, women were pretty much second-class status. Unanswered pleas from those such as Abigail Adams to her husband John Adams were unheard. Right? I desire you should remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. yeah, remember you're getting, I can't remember the name for it, but remember you were getting the daughters of, I believe it was the daughters of liberty that would go ahead and sew uh, uniforms, right? They would have spinning wars on who could spin the most uniforms and provide textiles for the military, but very patriarchal still. The institution of slavery contradicted the spirit of revolution and that all men are created equal. For a time, the leaders of the revolution recognized that this did take some corrective steps. The Continental Congress abolished importation of enslaved people, and most states went along with the prohibition. Most northern states ended slavery, while in the South, some voluntarily freed their slaves. However, in the decades following the war, more and more slave owners came to believe that slave labor was essential to the economy, as explained in later chapters. They developed a rationale for slavery, found religious and political justification for continuing to hold human beings in lifelong bondage. So the slave trade will be abolished. So before this happens, you will see a massive importation of slaves because they knew it was coming to an end. But slavery will continue definitely in the South. Okay. So that was a longer chapter. But let's go through this. Lexington Concord, Bunker Hill, first shots at our battle. Very important to understand. Great Britain's kicking the colonists' butt. Second Continental Congress, what this calls for in terms of military. So this is the meeting that's established what's going to happen in terms of how we're going to go ahead and deal with Great Britain. Some want peace, some want war, some want independence. Right. So the military action they do is they create an army. George Washington is, of course, the first to command this army, despite his lack of experience. I mean, he's more experienced than most, but still not that experienced. But you're still getting a lot of middle colonies that are calling for peace with Great Britain. Let's just go back to the good old days prior to 1763 when we all got along and you just left us alone. Thomas Paine's common sense is arguing for this independence, and he goes ahead and he's able to push people to support independence from the king, which is Declaration of Independence, the breakup letter, where we're saying, hey, life was great, we loved you, but you changed, I've changed, let's move on. So we get the Revolutionary War, which is obviously the war against Great Britain. And we're getting the Patriots. The Patriots are those that support the cause. You're getting roughly, I want to say, 40% of the population was this. Go back and check. And you're getting 30% that were loyalists and Tories, right? They supported the king. A lot of them are going to leave. Leave after the war is over because they want to escape punishment. The Tories were very wealthy. They were more I'm tired. They had more association to the mother country, right? They were Anglicans. They supported the Church of England. African Americans would tend to favor typically they would go ahead and favor the Patriots more. American Indians would favor the Loyalists more because remember it was a colonist that wanted to expand westward. America would lose and they would get the butt kicked very much in the beginning stages, and that's because economically, remember, they were relying on Great Britain. However, after I believe it was the Battle of Saratoga, then we'd get an alliance with France. France would see that hey, maybe they have a chance, and they would provide us naval services. They would give us resources. Holland and Spain would do the same thing, and this is going to be a huge reason for our victory. But remember, we get to pay them back. Organization of new governments. Think about separation of powers, 3 branches. That was one thing that was common in the state governments. You are also getting a Bill of Rights. That's another thing that's very important in state governments. So I said here, freedom of religion, different branches, checks and balances. Voting was limited to white men with property. Right? Office holding, white men with a lot of property. And that's because they felt that these people were educated, but at the same time they had more stake in terms of the success of the government. Articles of Confederation was the first government that was set up. Ratification means it was passed. I mean, it was passed only if New York and Virginia decided to let go of their land that was in the Ohio River Valley. Because remember, that was land that was owned by New York and Virginia, but through the land ordinance, it was remember that this could be land that's considered just free territory, and they could go ahead and be established in the states later on. Once that happens, then we're getting everyone that passes it, but you're getting a one-house government. All it was legislative branch. There was no president, so nothing could be enforced, right? So when we're looking at the accomplishments, set up the Land Ordinance Act, as well as that was pretty much go back Land Ordinance Act, and there was another act. Let me go back because I can't remember. It's on the tip of my tongue. You also want to make sure you mention, here it is, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This provides a procedure into which how a territory would become a state. Problems: no taxation. They couldn't raise an army. They couldn't pay back their debts to France and Great Britain, and also Spain. So they were more likely going to be attacked. You're also looking at no military. So when you're looking at Shays' Rebellion, when you're getting these veterans whose farms are being foreclosed and they're not being paid their money that they were promised for the war, um, Massachusetts is basically going and asking the federal government to send voluntary troops over. No one's going to do that, right? Social change: no more nobility, no more aristocracy that exists, no more inheritance of land. Abolition of church and state: Church of England is gone, and eventually the Congregational Church will be gone by 1830s. Right? Women, still a very patriarchal society. They contribute a lot to the war. Some volunteered, some would disguise as men and fight in the war, but most of their contribution was economic. Right? Slavery would still exist, but the slave trade under Articles of Confederation would be abolished. So you could still have slaves, but you can't bring them in anymore. So slave trade there would be a date that would be abolished for it. So with that in mind, there would be a huge rush to bring in slaves. Okay, and that is it. Do not worry about the history perspectives part.